So the first thing I'm going to start building is the underskirt for this dress. I have to be honest, as much as I love panniers, they're kind of distracting and they don't look like part of the human form. So I just want to cover it with the underskirt first, and then after that I'll work on the bodice and the overskirt. So for the underskirt, what's most important is that this circumference gets covered. So I have a rectangle here that's slightly bigger than this circumference, and then everything else I'm going to pin in and shape so that it fits into the waistband. So the first thing I want to do is mark the center front of my giant rectangle. So we have it in half. I'm just going to put a giant mark here. And now I'm going to place this on the center front. I'm going to close it up on the center back around the widest part of the pannier. I'm going to not attach it at the waist. I'm going to have it pretty far above the waist, you know, almost to the sternum, because I just want to make sure that I have enough room. And I'm going to pin this. It has to be symmetrical, so it has to be horizontal to the ground. And I will give myself a little extra room, so it doesn't have to be skin tight around the diameter, but close enough. So here's my front. Looks pretty funny, it looks like a giant paper bag. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pin shut the back. Just want to make sure that while I'm tugging on the fabric that I don't accidentally slit this open. So I have my shape. Now all I have to do is to manipulate all that fabric so that it hugs the pannier smoothly. And looking at the research that the designer had given me, that 18th century gown, I'm also going to use those pleats that she had done. I'm not going to do the multi-pleats that the upper bodice is going to have. These are just like nuts and bolts pleats in order to get a smooth fit over the pannier. So this right here, and I'm just going to pin into the pannier for now. That's my first one. Pleat it here. Pleat this one here. Maybe one more pleat. Here, I'll leave that for later. I'm going to do the same on the back. Pleats. See these pleats here. And this part isn't going to be seen because the overskirt is going to be on it. So I don't really have to worry too much about these details. Now I'm going to slit here and here. And I'm hoping I have enough material. It looks like I just barely do for this part right here. Good. So you see how we have this shape here? It does look pretty ridiculous, doesn't it? But once we get the skirt completed and then we put the overdress over it, I can guarantee you it's still going to look weird because it's from the 1780s, but it'll look a bit more slick. I've pinned both sides of the skirt, and as usual, this was the side I pinned first, and I like the second side more that I pinned. So again, I'm just going to write up here, okay, and this is going to be the side that I'm going to use when I turn this into a paper pattern. While I'm at it, I can also just mark every place I've pinned it so that I can have these markings when I take this monstrosity apart. So I'm going to mark some of the pleat points like this, and I've marked where I pinned the top together. Maybe I'll put a little hash mark there. And before this comes apart, I'm going to mark it up like crazy in order for me to have all these reference points again. So I'm starting here, but I can finish that up later. The next thing that I want to work on is the waistband. Right now it's just kind of floating around the body. So I'm going to get a little ribbon, oops, and I'm going to tie it around the waist at the smallest part. Pin it in the back. There we go, looks good. So the ribbon is attached around the whole waist of the dress. And I'm going to mark everything. So I'm going to mark where the bottom of the ribbon ends at the skirt, like so. I guess I got to do this part too, where it's okay. That's the more important part, because that's the one I'm going to be using when I make the pattern. So I've drawn that line, and on the waistband I'm going to mark the center front, and I'm going to mark the side seams, so where I've pinned the front to the back. And I'll just do it on both sides too while I have it. And of course I'm going to mark the center back too. Trim off some extra. And the last thing about this skirt then is to get the hem. So this mannequin is a little bit tall. She's probably like 6 feet tall. But it's always good to have the skirt to be too long than it is too short. And since you can't see the bottom of this dress in the way I've set this video up, I'm going to put her on a platform, and then I can shorten this while you watch. On the side. So I'm just going to mark it to the ground. And rotate the figure. Because again, this is not something that you can really do with math, because depending on how far these side pieces stick out is how much longer it's going to be. So this is something that's best to do while it's on the form. Just don't want it to fall. Before she falls. Alrighty. Now I'm just going to cut away the bottom of the skirt. So here we have the skirt. I know it looks a little bulky, but once we get the top of the skirt on, everything's going to come together. Another important book in the costume construction business is a series of books by Janet Arnold, and they're called Patterns of Fashion. And she has them for a variety of periods, ending in like the 1940s. And what's so great about them is that she's taken apart dresses, and so here's a dress with the panniers, and she's taken them apart and she's kind of come up with a general pattern idea. So I don't know if all of this is going to particularly work in my case, but it's always nice to have a reference point. And in addition to that, I'm probably going to look at more 18th century dresses so that I can get a better idea about the details. I know that the swag and the flowers are from the 1920s, but like some of the elements of the bodice are definitely going to be from the 1800s. So I want to find some existing oldie-timey costumes from 1780 that might have some of those details, and then I can use those as a reference point while I'm draping. I found this bodice pattern inside Janet Arnold's book. This will help me create my bodice faster. It is interesting to look at the placement of how the pattern pieces go on the fabric. For example, the front part, usually the center front would go on the straight grain, but here it is turned so that the line from the shoulder to the point in the front is on the straight grain, so it goes diagonally across the body, and this makes it more strong for the boning that's going to be in there, and it makes it more flexible. You can see on this dress form that it has these really nice thick shoulder seams, and then it also has really nice side seams and the center front seam. And so it's very useful when you're draping, because that way when you have your fabric on your dress form, you can feel for where those seams are. And that way you can determine where the shoulder seam is or where the side seam is. And so if I'm draping a contemporary bodice such as this one, which is not in the show, I would use the shoulder seam and the side seams as they're depicted on the dress form. However, when you're dealing with a different period, like the 18th century, a lot of times these seams don't exist. So, for example, I'm pretty sure that this shoulder seam in the 18th century bodice is actually going to go all the way back to like here. And the side seam might not exist either. It might actually go farther back. So it's important to have the seams in the right place, because it makes the bodice fit better because of the seam placement. So I think I need to do a little bit more research before proceeding to draping the bodice, so that I'm going to be aware of where I'm going to put all the seams. So the Kyoto website has some wonderful Western 18th century dresses. They actually have a specifically wonderful collection, considering that they're Japanese. And I'm looking at these, and I can see that the sleeves and the shoulder seam are pretty far back. This is the Victoria and Albert, and here I can see that that front piece is actually really smooth. It's very strange. And then I can also see that the sleeves and the back seam are similar to the Kyoto. And then here's the Met Museum, and they also have the same type of sleeves, and that means I'm pretty sure where my sleeves are going to go. And so this is the type of research that I have to do in order to accomplish my dress. And since this is a symmetrical dress, I just have to drape one side of the mannequin. And I'm going to choose the actor right side, because eventually I'm going to put the arm into the mannequin. So I just want to have all my work on this side. So I'm going to start out with the front of the bodice, and looking at, I have my guide here, which is on the table. And so the way I'm placing the muslin on the dress form is not on the straight grain, but it's going to go diagonally. And this is because when there's bones in the bodice, you want the straight of grain to be in the sturdiest part of the bodice. So I'm going to pin, this is my grain, and I'm pinning it at the center front at the bottom of the corset, and then this is going to go to the shoulder seam. Even though I'm not going to create a seam there, I'm just using that as a marker. So I have this line here, and now I'm going to mark the center front. So far, so good. Now I'm going to smooth this around and pin it flat. Again, I'm just going to pin it to the side seam, but I'm not going to create a seam there. That's just a guiding line for me to pin it. So you see I've pinned it to here. So now what I need to do is to trim some of the extra fabric away, because it's not allowing me to smooth it the way I want it to. So I'm going to trim it here. trim the center front. And then I'm going to trim some of this excess here. So now I can smooth this out. In general, I'm going to be following the corset line for the cutout in the front. So that's already been established. So I'm kind of tracing that. I'm going to do the top of the bodice slightly above the corset line because we don't want to see that corset sticking out. So I've pinned this part, I'm going to mark it. I've marked my center front. I'm going to feel for where the corset ends because I like that line. This. And then the armhole, again, I'm going to be looking at my research. The armhole is pretty tight. Goes around like this. Sorry. And so here's my side seam, but I'm going to be extending it so that it goes farther back. And this is where looking at the extant research comes in handy because I was staring at all those bodices, and I know that the front piece extends not just to the side of the bodice, but kind of to the side back like this. But I also, just for me, I'm going to mark the side seam, just so I know where it's at. Okay, so this is as far as I'm getting for now, and now I have to reconfigure everything and prepare my other new pieces. So I've continued to draw my shape all the way around here, as well as towards the back. And so what I want to do now, I have a smaller pair of scissors because this is going to require some more finesse, is I'm going to trim the rest of this shape apart. So here's my side back seam. You see how the front, it's all one piece and extends to here. So instead of chopping it off right at the line, I'm going to cut it like with a little bit of extra because I'm going to have to pin my next piece to this piece. And I also want to cut out the armhole right now. And again, I'm going to leave a little bit of seam allowance so that I can, in case I have to attach something to it. Maybe I'll clip into here so that it lies smooth. I'm following the same, I'm chopping into the corset the same way, the bodice the same way the corset has these flaps. And that makes it able to pull it really tight around the waist like this. Okay, so that's my front and side, and now we're going to go on to the back and the side back. And in case you haven't noticed, I forgot to mention, I took those panniers off while draping the bodice because here I am moving all over this bodice and I don't want to have this giant pannier in the way because I can't see very well. So I took that off temporarily. I'm going to do the bodice and then I'm going to put the underskirt back on in order to drape that pleated flowered monstrosity. So now we're moving on to the back of the bodice, and I'm just going to put it on the fold here, which means I'm just going to place my fabric straight up and down. The pattern pieces from the research, there's a center back seam, and it's slightly curved, and there's a lot of engineering involved in the seams as they were developed in the 18th century. But we're simplifying this dress a little bit because it is a theater piece. Only the front really needs to look good. And also the way the designer had designed it with her 1920s influences, it's okay to simplify this. It's not exactly 100% period. So we're simplifying the back a little bit. So I'm pinning up the center back, just to place it. And then I'm going to smooth this across. Just pin it down a little bit. And then I'm going to chop off the excess fabric because it's hard to work when you have all this fabric. Okay, so smoothing this. I want this to be nice and smooth against the back. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to release these pins, and I'm going to create a seam that combines this back piece, meaning the front piece, and it's going to get combined with the back piece. So I'm just going to pin it on this line and connect it with the back piece. So here's the shape now, and I'm going to mark where I've pinned it on the other side. I'm also going to mark where the waist lies, and I'm going to mark the center back. And again, I'm using my big fat seam on the mannequin to locate where the center back is. Here and here, and then that's going to be a straight line. And I'll write center back here, just to be safe. Now in the costume sketch, the back of the corset the back of the bodice does not run right along the back of the corset. The designer has made it a little bit higher. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this line, like this, and it's going to connect at the shoulder seam right here. And I can mark that line, and then I'm going to mark the rest of the armhole. This. Trim the excess fabric. And maybe I'll also mark where it falls on the corset and where else. I'll make a little hash mark here so that I know where it connects to. And here's the bodice. Front, this attached side front, and the back. So, moving on to the next step is the sleeve. So, onto the sleeve. As you can see, I've attached my trusty arm onto the mannequin, and now I'm going to drape the sleeve on this dress. So I'm going to start with my fabric piece. I'm going to take it in half, and I'm going to place, even though the shoulder seam is not on my dummy seam line, I'm still placing my fabric on the dummy's shoulder seam line, right here. And so I want to, I'm going to shape this around the arm as it sticks out like this. And I'm only going to do it from this point here to that point there, and then we'll deal with the armpit afterwards. So I'm going to start with the top of the shoulder, and I'm pinning this around the armhole line that I've drawn with my Sharpie. So the fabric is slightly see-through, so that's good because I can kind of see where the line is. So I'm stopping, again, as I said, kind of right here, and then on the back. I'm going to stop kind of there also, and what I'm going to do is take advantage of where that seam is, and that's where I'm going to end, so that the sleeve seam is going to be the same place as the bodice seam. So I'm going to continue to pin this line here. Good, got that. And I'm going to trim just this part. Draping sleeves is a little bit difficult. A lot of times it's more efficient to draft the sleeves, so that way you can just take a whole bunch of measurements. But the problem is the armpit is very difficult to deal with. So I have the top of the sleeve here, and now I'm going to work my way around the bottom. before I work my way around the bottom of the sleeve, I'm just going to mark where my shoulder seam is going to be up to that pivoting point. And I'm going to again mark where I think the shoulder is naturally, and then I'm going to also mark where the shoulder seam is on the dress. So that's right here. And I'll write SS here so that I'm aware of where it is. So what happens now is that this sleeve takes a pivot. So it goes from being at the top of the sleeve, I have to drape it to the underside. So I slid it exactly to where these points are, and now I'm going to take this fabric and I'm going to flip it on the underside like this. And again, I'm following the general pattern that I got from the Janet Arnold book from the research. So now I'm pinning up the bottom, the underside, the sleeve. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pin it together so I can get a general idea of the volume. See, this is a little bit big. So I'll try to tighten it. This. And then I'm going to shorten it right at the crook of the elbow. So remember, the elbow is, the crook is right where your elbow bends. So I have that located here, and I'm just going to trim that to get some of this excess fabric out of the way. And then I'm going to repin where I think it needs to go. So here's the sleeve. I've pinned it here, but that's not where I want the seam to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark on the mannequin where I want the seam to go. And when I take the sleeve off, I'm going to slit it right here. But I'm going to keep the pins in on this side of the bodice. Great, so we have our sleeve, we have our bodice. And there's two things left to do on the bodice. There's the sleeve ruffles, and then there's the ruffle that goes around the neck. I'm thinking maybe of doing that after the upper skirt, because I want to kind of get a whole look of the proportions, because the sleeve ruffles might end up being really big in order to kind of balance out that giant skirt. So those details I'm going to do at the very end after the rest of the dress has been draped. So I've placed the skirt back on underneath the bodice. This is the underskirt. And I have to say, this dress gave me a lot of agitation when I draped it the first time. I remember I went to sleep thinking about how these pleats were being made. So luckily, it's 2 years later, maybe I have some better insight into it. But for one, I'm not going to be able to drape this with this arm sticking out. So I'm going to pull the arm out temporarily. I can always stick it back in later. So it goes. That. Okay, so and the other part about this top skirt that's going to be attaching to the bodice is I'm really not concerned about the center front and the center back. I'm mostly concerned about these damn pleats because they drive me crazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to work on this part of the skirt. So I have my fabric piece. I'm going to fold it in half. And I'm going to place it right at the waist where it hits the side seam. So you can see from the center front there's like a good 2 inches. And I'll just pin this sculpted piece onto another piece when I get to the front. For right now, I just have to work on these pleats. So let me also just put the sleeve on, pin the sleeve aside. All right, so the pleats are going from the waist out. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a line of pleats that run across the top. Maybe one more here. So looking at it from the side view here, this looks like a nice continual line of pleats. So I'm going to pause this clip and I'm going to even out the pleats. So I've cleaned up these pleats up here on the top. They're now even and they're pretty smooth. So the next thing I want to do is just kind of anchor this piece down onto the underskirt. And again, as I was saying in my introduction, there's too much volume down here because by the time we're down here, it's supposed to be flat as a pancake. So my next step is to eliminate excess fabric in the lower part of this top skirt. So the first way I can eliminate excess fabric is to drag this thing over as far as I can. So I've just eliminated this much. This much fabric. I'm going to do the same in the front. So my new line will be that like that. And then the next place that I can eliminate excess fabric is by creating a side seam here. And I'm going to trim out that excess seam allowance. This, again, I can't see what I'm doing. So it's almost there. You can see there is still a little bit of fullness right here. A little bit full here. So I think what I can do is maybe pull out just a little bit more seam allowance on those sides. Like that. Here we go. So it's relatively smooth down at the bottom where the scalloped edge is going to be, and then it's nice and gathered at the top. So I've taken care of the side of this giant skirt, and so now I just have to stick a piece, insert a piece into the front, and that should be pretty simple. Well, it's starting to look a little bit like an 18th century dress, isn't it? So I'm happy with where the pleats are on the upper skirt, and I've attached a piece in the center so that I now have a complete half skirt. And again, I only need to do half of the skirt, but because I have that center swag, I extended the material farther over so I can get a look at the whole swag. And I did the same on the back of the dress too, to figure out the swags. So I'm a proponent of form follows function, and I feel like for this swag, it should come right from where the seam is. And so I'm going to be using this seam to make the swags. And I think they end, I'm just looking at the research, I would say that it should end around here. And they're kind of the same length, so I'm just going to eyeball it. Swag goes like this. And then the other swag goes like this. All the way around. And if you remember with the sketch, the swag ended kind of like here. Even that out. And then the back swag is going to go, it's a big one, and it just goes all the way across like that. So I'm going to even out those lines I just drew, and then I'm going to trim them off. So I've evened out and cut out the scalloped edges on this dress, in the back and in the front. So I can see it really well, but you might not be able to see it as well as me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin some black twill tape around the edges in order to make it more graphic so that I can get a good sense of the proportions. Many of you probably, if you've worked in a lab before, you've used white twill tape to sew name tags onto costumes. So we also have it in black color, and this is frequently used to create style lines on a muslin fitting because it's so thick and yet it's flexible and you can move it, right? So I'm just going to pin this on real quick, and then that way we can get a better sense with my high-tech camera technology. We'll be able to see a little bit better where the scalloped edge ends. Because again, I'd like to have these proportions for when I make the neck ruffle and the sleeve ruffles, because it would be very nice to kind of mirror the curves of this scalloped edge on the sleeve ruffles. So I'm going to finish up, but this is looking good, right? So I'm going to finish pinning that on. So I've pinned on this black tape so that you can get a better look at things. And if you notice down here, I decided I liked more, I corrected it because I like that line more. So I'm going to trim this off. And this is why the style lines really help in creating a shape. And again, I can always check with the costume designer, who's the ultimate one to make the decisions. So if she wants the proportions different, I can just reshape the whole thing. So here's the front, and then the back. Well, the center back ends here. So the skirt's done, bodice is done. So the only thing left to do are the sleeve ruffles, the center piece, and the ruffle around the neck. So the next thing that I'm going to drape is the stomacher. The stomacher is exactly what it sounds like. It goes across the stomach right here. Originally, a stomacher was a decorative piece that you put on over your dress bodice, because frequently the dress bodices were closed in the front, so you'd have these big lacings, and in order to make that pretty, you would put a stomacher over it. So that's how it started out, but we're using the stomacher more as a decorative item. So I have my fabric here. I'm just going to fold it in half, and I'm going to place it down right on the center front. And the stomacher basically follows the line of the corset. So that means I'm going to place it, and I'm basically just going to feel and look at the lines of the corset. So for example, the top of the dress ends here. So that's where the top of my stomacher is going to be. And then I'm going to extend it to about here, because if I extended it too far, it would be lumpy. So you want to extend it as far as you can without compromising the shape of the dress underneath. And then here's the bottom of the corset here. So that's going to be the end. So essentially I'm just drawing a line from here to here. Ta-da! I'm going to take this. I'm going to cut that out on the fold. And then here's my stomacher. So I think just to give it additional authenticity, what I'm going to do is put some boning in it, because that's going to stiffen the dress up a bit more. She already has a corset on underneath. He already has a corset on underneath. But there's going to be some additional light boning in the dress body as well as the stomacher. The stomacher gets heavily boned so that you can't move, because that we noticed that's how people rolled back in the 1750s. So I'm going to put some boning in here, and then I'll reattach it to the dress. So I've mocked up this little half-scale stomacher, and it's very stiff. I've put some boning in it. The way I do boning for mock-ups is I just take surgical tape, and I tape the boning to the fabric, so there's no sewing involved, thank goodness. So I'm just going to pin this on the center front, and I'm lining up the top of the stomacher with the top of the bodice. You want it to be even. Yikes. It's hard to pin through this surgical tape. As a side note, apparently the Romanov family, when they were shot to death during the Russian Revolution, the women had so many bones in their corsets that the bullets didn't go through, and so they had to kill them in another way. So these bones can be maybe a lifesaver as well. All right, that's enough for now. So the stomacher has been pinned on. It's nice and stiff. He's not going to be moving very much. So now it's on to the sleeve ruffles. The sleeve ruffles in French are called engageants, because when you move your arms around a lot, you've got these ruffles, you're very engaging. So I like to say engageant, but in common conversation it gets a little annoying. And I'm like, well, Mrs. Designer, what about the engageants? So you can also just say sleeve ruffles. I think because this dress is so big, I suggested to the costume designer that she should have something very ebullient, and I think a full double circle ruffle, if it's a circle, would look really good for this. So I'm going to drape that, and then I can show that to her and see what she thinks. Because the other option is to take a long rectangle and scrunch it up and then stick it on there, and that's more period for the 18th century. But I think since it's the 1920s, and we're already going to have some kind of a 1920s neck ornament, that we can go crazy with the engageants as well. So what I want to do is make two circles, stick them together, and then put them on the sleeve. So I have to measure how big the elbow is. And in this case it is 5 inches. And then I want to see how long these engageants should be. So let's say if they stick out, they should stick out, I would say 3 inches looks good. If you make it like 5 inches, it's long sleeves. So maybe let's just go with 3.5 inches. So my circle is going to be 3.5 inches. And now I got some math to do, as usual. It's my weakest part. So here are my sleeve ruffles and some delightful math again. We've established that the circumference of the arm is 5 inches. However, I want to have not just one circle going around the elbow, but I want 2 circles. So 5 divided in half will give me two 2.5-inch circles. So I'm going to make 2 circles. Circumference equals pi d, so the circumference is 2.5, which means the diameter is going to be 0.79 inches. And I would say that should be between 3/4 and 7/8 of an inch. So with the measurements that I have, I'm just going to make 2 sleeve ruffles right quick. I fold this in half. This will give me 2 ruffles. Then I'm going to make 2 circles. So here's half of a circle, and here's the other half. My diameter is between 3/4 and 7/8 of an inch, so that's kind of here and here. It's a pretty tiny circle. So I'm going to draw this circle, and then I wanted the length of the ruffle at 3.5. Ooh boy, let's make it 3.25. Again, I didn't cut enough fabric, so I'm just going to mark the center here. Fold this in half. And fold it into quarters. And I'm just going to mark 3.25 all along here because I don't trust myself to draw a perfect quarter circle. It'll end up looking like a clover leaf. So here we are. Oops. 3.25. I'm just going to cut this out. And I'm going to cut out my little tiny circle in the middle. 2 circles. So now I'm going to attach the 2 to each other in order to make a double ruffle. So I've put a slit in here where the grain goes straight up and down, not on the bias or anything. And I'm going to attach one to the other. So now I'm going to pin the sleeve ruffle onto the sleeve. I'm sorry, the engagement. And I think I'm going to put the 2 seams at the crook of the elbow, and then the other one will just be on the side. So I'm going to match up one of the seams to my sleeve seam here, and one on the other. And this should fit very smoothly around the elbow. There shouldn't be that much excess fabric if I did my math right and got the circumference of the circle correct. Put one more in here. And there you have a very dramatic sleeve. I wish I could move this around so you could get all the action. So the last step in here is to get this unusual bib that the designer has placed. And this is truly a hallmark of a 1920s dress versus an 18th century dress, because 18th century dresses did not have any bibs. So I'm going to be adding this around the neckline. Let's see, first I'll pin a little hole, cut a little hole, get that around. I'll put that on here. And then I think I'm going to lay this flat, and I'm just going to pin out the shoulder seam so that the front and the backs lay flat. So here's one shoulder seam, and I'm just going to go ahead and do both sides, and I'll figure out which side I like more after I do both sides. So here's one adjusted shoulder seam, and here's the other. So I have this laid out here, and now I'm just going to carefully, mark where this goes. And I'm going to figure out where the neckline is. I know here, that's the top of the stomacher, so that's definitely here. And then here I'm just going to trace I guess I'm just doing half the mannequin because I don't have the trace on the other side. So here's the front, and then I'm going to rotate this around. And here's the back. Here's the back. And the top of the dress is So here, it goes around the shoulders. And I have the shoulder seam marked here. So I have the neckline drawn, and now I'm going to kind of draw a general shape for the yoke. And I'm just going to do it on one half, and then I'm going to take it off the mannequin, and I'm going to put it on the double, and then redo it. So I think this looks good like here, and then it goes narrow on top, like this. I mean, it's very unusual because it's a 1920s idea. And then in the back, I think it should be a little bit higher, so it'll go kind of like this. Boop. So I'm going to take this off the form, put it on the fold, and then reattach it. So this is a completed dress. Wasn't very difficult, was it? We have our unusual neckline, we have our sleeve ruffles, we have the top skirt, the bottom skirt, the bodice, and the stomacher. So it was a lot of work to drape this, but I gotta tell you, it's gonna be even more difficult to put it together because there's a lot of construction-wise happening in this dress. So not only am I a draper and a pattern maker, but I'm also an expert at putting costumes together. So there it is. So here's a fitting photo of the big green dress that Lady Romola, aka Miles, aka Harrison Marks, our actor, wears for Actor Lady. So we've made it fit on one half of him, and then we've placed the flowers. So you can get a general idea about how this dress is processing. Here's Harrison in his final fabric fitting, although it doesn't really look that final to me. For example, he's wearing a t-shirt underneath, and so we have to clip the extra fabric around the t-shirt so that we know how it fits under the dress that he's going to be wearing. Because all the details, like the collar and the cuffs and the flowers, I can do without him standing in the costume. So this was just to get a final fit on the dress. So here are just a couple of quick photos of me trying to get stuff done on the dress. So you can see here, that's the mannequin, and I think I'm pitting those floral swags onto the bodice. And then here is the final dress. So again, the actor doesn't actually have to be inside the dress for me to get all the details done. Looks pretty good. And one final look as Harrison, as Miles, as Lady Romola. It is a beautiful dress. The costume designer did a terrific job. And if you have any questions about this or any comments, I would be very, very happy to talk to you about it.